I didn't see the island until the ferry was nearly on top of it. Even then, it rose out of the winter gray water more like a suggestion than land, an uneven mass of rock and stubborn grass, crowned by the lighthouse that would become my world for the next 6 months. The tower stood like a bone jutting out of the shoreline, pale and cold, with its lantern room gazing blankly over the churning sea. Nothing about it felt welcoming. Nothing about it felt intentionally built by human hands either. More like it had insisted on being there, and people simply worked around it. When I stepped onto the dock, the boards groaned under my boots as if objecting to my presence. The wind smelled of salt and iron. Behind me, the ferry's engine rumbled impatiently, ready to leave even before I'd gotten my bearings. A man waited for me near a pile of storage crates. Tall, thin, wearing a government-issued parka zipped to the throat. He looked like someone who had forgotten how to be warm. "You're Jonas Mercer?" he asked. I nodded. "That's me." "Good. I'm Hale. I keep the station running in the off-season." His voice sounded rehearsed. "The supply boat comes every 10 days, weather permitting. If something breaks, you log it. If something concerns you, you log it. If something unusual happens, you absolutely log it." I didn't miss the subtle shift in his tone on the word unusual. It wasn't a joke. Still, I tried to pretend this was just another remote job. I'd told myself that repeatedly on the way here, because the alternative was admitting why I'd really taken the position. The lighthouse was not far from where my brother's fishing boat had disappeared 3 years ago. The Coast Guard had claimed it was a storm, an accident, nothing anomalous. But the body was never found, and the last thing his crew reported over the radio was the light from a tower that should have been dark. That tower was now 600 feet ahead of me. "Let me show you where you'll be staying," Hale said. We walked along a narrow trail leading to the base of the lighthouse. The building attached to it, my living quarters, was a squat concrete structure painted a color that might have once been white. Now it looked more like sun-bleached bone. As soon as the door opened, a sharp draft swept out, carrying the faint scent of old metal and something else. Something like stone soaked in the ocean for far too long. Hale didn't seem to notice it. Inside, the place was simple: a bed, a desk, a radio, bare walls that felt like they were waiting to see what I'd do. It was cleaner than I expected, but had the unmistakable atmosphere of rooms that remember previous occupants. "You'll find everything you need in here," Hale said. "Food stores in the pantry, medical supplies in the cabinet, and this." He reached into his coat and handed me a small, hardbound notebook. Its cover was a dull olive color, edges softened with age. "These are the operational rules, written by the previous keeper." I frowned. "I thought the last guy retired?" Hale paused, just long enough for the silence to stretch. "He left," he said. "Didn't say where he was going." That wasn't an answer, but I didn't press. Not yet. He stepped aside, letting me take in the tower entrance, an iron door set into the concrete with a thick wheel lock like something from a submarine. Its design felt too industrial for a simple lighthouse. Too secure. "You'll want to read that book before nightfall," Hale added. "Why before nightfall? Because the first rule applies tonight." This man was not being dramatic. His posture was too stiff, his eyes too neutral. He was reciting necessities. "When does nightfall count here?" I asked. "Any time the sun is below the horizon, and tonight that'll be around 4:30. He checked his watch. "You have maybe 2 hours. A shiver traced down my spine, but curiosity pushed through it. "What kind of rules are we talking about?" "You'll see." Hale zipped up his coat. "I'll be heading back on the ferry. After that, you're on your own." "Just like that? That's the job." He turned to leave, but stopped at the doorway, hand resting lightly against the cold metal frame. "Jonas," he said quietly, "don't assume the rules are optional. Don't assume they're metaphors. Don't assume they're outdated." He held my gaze, and for a moment something strained behind his eyes. Fear, fatigue, maybe both. "And whatever you do," he added, "never look at the light when it goes still." "What does that mean?" I asked. But Hale was already walking away, boots thudding heavily against the gravel, shoulders tight beneath his parka. By the time I reached the door, the ferry was pulling away from the dock, carrying him back to the mainland and leaving me in the settling quiet, alone. A gull cried overhead, the sound thin and ghost-like. The wind scraped across the exterior of the lighthouse, making the metal joints hum faintly. I closed the door and felt the weight of isolation press in around me. The notebook sat on the desk like something alive. I hesitated before picking it up. The cover was cold, too cold for something that had been inside. The first page crackled as I opened it. No title, no date, just handwriting, small, controlled, but deeply indented into the paper as though the writer pressed hard to keep his hand from shaking. Rules for the Lightkeeper, in effect immediately. Do not alter, do not ignore. Beneath that heading were 7 rules. I forced myself not to skim them, but to read each carefully, absorbing the weight of every word. Rule 1. When the sun sets, lock the tower door from the inside. If you hear knocking after that, ignore it. Do not speak through the door. Do not attempt to see who is knocking. I felt a chill bloom beneath my skin. Rule 2. At night, keep the lighthouse lamp rotating. If it stops on its own, do not touch it. Descend the stairs, wait exactly 7 minutes, then return. If it is still stopped, do not look directly at the lens. I exhaled slowly, pulse drumming in my ears. Rule 3. If you see a ship approaching after midnight, radio it once. Only once. Do not acknowledge any response if it doesn't use the call sign you gave. Rule 4. Avoid the eastern window, especially between 1 and 2 a.m. If you must pass it, keep your eyes forward. Do not look at your reflection in the glass. My breath caught slightly on that one. Rule 5. If you wake up to the foghorn sounding, even if you did not activate it, do not leave your bed until it stops. The sound is not for you. Rule 6. If you hear someone speak your name inside the tower, do not reply. Your voice is the only one allowed in here. The handwriting became more frantic near the end. Rule 7. If the light goes still and the sea becomes silent, descend the tower immediately and stay away from all windows. Do not try to understand what you see. Do not look at the horizon. Do not, under any circumstances, call out to it. My hands trembled slightly as I closed the notebook. This was absurd, and yet not. Something in the tone of those written words, something desperate, something earnest, made them feel less like superstition and more like the final fragments of a man trying to survive. A sudden gust of wind rattled the tower door, metal groaning against metal. The sound echoed through the quarters like a warning. The sun was already sinking behind thick clouds. I checked the time, 4:02. In 28 minutes, night would fall. I set the notebook down, swallowed hard, and headed toward the tower staircase. Every instinct urged me to turn back, to call the ferry, to abandon this entire plan. But beneath those instincts was something darker, something older. I had come here for a reason, and whatever waited in the tower, in the rules, in the darkness beyond the waves, I needed to know. The tower's interior felt colder than the outside air, as if the stone itself rejected warmth. The spiral staircase wound upward like the inside of a shell, each step worn smooth by decades, maybe lifetimes of footsteps. Mine echoed in uneven patterns as though the acoustics didn't entirely agree with the laws of sound. The lantern room at the top greeted me with a dim, amber glow from the backup bulbs strung across the ceiling. The lamp itself, a massive Fresnel lens with concentric rings of polished glass, sat in the center like a frozen eye. Even inert, it had presence, not just in size but in the way it commanded attention. The metal base was old but meticulously maintained, a precise machinery of gears and rotational mechanisms. I placed a hand on it. Cold. Not the normal cold of metal, but the deeper kind, like it carried the temperature of the ocean floor. The wind pushed against the tower windows, producing a low, distant moan. Maybe it was just the air whistling through tiny imperfections in the structure. Maybe, but the noise had an unnerving rhythm, a kind of half-formed syllable, as if saying Jonas without fully forming the word. I pulled back from the lens. The notebook rules pressed against my thoughts like a weight. Absurd. Hale had warned not to take them lightly. And after reading them, part of me understood why. Not through logic, but through something primal. Instinct. I found the switch for the motor and flipped it on. A mechanical hum filled the room, and the great lens began its rotation. Slow, deliberate, steady. The beams swept across the ocean and vanished into the thickening dusk. Satisfied, I descended the stairs. Back in my quarters, the shadows had grown long and restless. I checked the time again, 4:28, nightfall. The moment the sun dropped below the horizon, an almost physical shift settled over the building. The hum of the rotating lamp pulsed through the walls. I felt it in my teeth. Not painful, just aware. Too aware. I locked the tower door exactly as Rule 1 demanded, sealing myself inside. As the last of the daylight died, silence pressed in from all sides. For a few minutes, nothing happened. Then, knocking. Soft at first. 3 taps. Deliberate. Human. My breath stilled in my throat. Rule 1 came rushing back with brutal clarity. If you hear knocking after sunset, ignore it. Do not speak. Do not attempt to see who is knocking. I sat rigid on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor, refusing to react. Another knock. Louder. Then 2 more, closer, almost impatient. The tower walls seemed to vibrate with each impact. The knocks weren't coming from the entrance to my quarters, but from the iron tower door itself, the one I had just locked, the one I was not allowed to approach. Jonas. The voice was faint, muffled by metal. But it knew my name. A shiver rippled down my spine. I didn't respond. Jonas, open the door. I pressed my hand flat against my thigh to keep it from shaking. The voice didn't sound threatening. It sounded familiar, like my older brother, Elias. The cadence, the soft rasp on certain consonants, the exact rise and fall of his tone when asking something serious. Impossible. I squeezed my eyes shut and focused on the rules. If I broke them on the very first night, what would that prove? That I was reckless? That I came here for answers only to be tricked by sound and loneliness? Or that something truly was outside, wearing my brother's voice like a mask? The knocking stopped. The silence that followed felt worse. Minutes passed, maybe more. I didn't check the time. I didn't move. Only when the foghorn sounded, deep, distant, but undeniably real, did my body jolt. It boomed across the island like a warning bell from another world. Rule 5 whispered through my memory. If you wake to the foghorn sounding, even if you did not activate it, do not leave your bed until it stops. The sound is not for you. I wasn't in bed, but the principle felt close enough. I stayed still. The horn bellowed again, louder this time, vibrating the floor beneath me. What was it signaling? Who was it intended for? The fog outside was thickening. I could see it smearing across the small quarter windows like pale fingers. Shadows formed in the mist, stretching in ways shadows shouldn't, unsteady, unnatural. The horn eventually fell silent, replaced by the rhythmic sweep of the lighthouse beam. I exhaled shakily. The worst was over, I told myself. First night nerves, auditory hallucinations. The lighthouse was old, full of echoes. The human mind was wired to create patterns out of chaos. I repeated these rationalizations until they felt almost believable. Almost. The rest of the night dragged by slowly. I kept myself awake by organizing the supplies, checking the radio frequencies, cleaning the already clean desk. Anything to avoid thinking about the knocking, about the voice. When the first hint of dawn crept through the clouds, I felt my body finally unclench like a tightly wound spring released. The sun rose sluggishly, bleeding pale light across the water. With it came an almost perceptible easing of the pressure in the building. I unlatched the tower door carefully. Nothing waited outside. No footprints on the concrete walkway. No signs of disturbance. Only the endless expanse of fog dissolving under the morning light. Relief washed through me, brief, thin. But then I saw the door. On the outside, around the edges of the iron wheel lock, the metal was scratched. Deeply. Thin marks dragged downward in patterns that resembled fingernails or claws. Not human in shape, but human in intention. As if something had tried to mimic the act of knocking and gotten the anatomy wrong. A cold knot tightened in my chest. I backed away from the door. Later, after forcing myself to eat a stale oatmeal bar for breakfast, I opened the notebook again. I wanted to understand its tone better, whether it was the panicked ramblings of a man losing his mind or a purposeful warning. There were faint indentations on the page under the rules, like someone had written something and torn it out. The pressure marks formed fragments of words. Not alone. Light is wrong. Don't listen when. The last line cut off abruptly. I flipped through the rest, searching for any new notes or clues. Between 2 pages, something fluttered out, a strip of paper folded tightly into a narrow rectangle. I unfolded it. A single sentence, written in the same handwriting but shakier. If you start hearing your own thoughts in someone else's voice, leave the island immediately. My pulse slowed, then quickened again in a nauseating cycle. The voice last night, it hadn't been mine. And it hadn't just been familiar, it had been perfect. A memory surfaced. Something Hale said, "Whatever you do, never look at the light when it goes still." But the lamp hadn't stopped last night. It hadn't gone still. That meant something else was happening. Something not even covered by Rule 2. Something that didn't need the lamp to stop to make itself known. I stepped outside, needing fresh air, even if it was cold and damp. Mist lingered along the shoreline, whispering against the rocks. The ocean beyond looked flat, almost mirror-like, as though reflecting a sky that didn't match our own. Far out on the horizon, just before the fog thinned entirely, I saw a shape. Not a boat, not an animal, not anything identifiable. A vertical silhouette. Too tall, too narrow, watching or waiting. Then the fog swallowed it. My hands instinctively tightened around the notebook. I didn't look at the horizon again. When I went back inside, the lighthouse felt different, as if aware, as if listening. I sat at the desk, opened the notebook to Rule 1, and whispered to no one. I followed the rules, so why did it still come? The tower didn't answer. But something in the walls seemed to breathe. End of part 2. Say continue. Morning light softened the island's hard edges, but it couldn't erase the unease curling at the base of my spine. Sleep had been impossible, so when the sun finally climbed above the horizon, I felt as brittle as driftwood. Everything inside the lighthouse, the walls, the air, even the light, seemed to pulse with a faint, residual hum from the night before. I tried to ground myself in mundane tasks. Breakfast, a sweep of the tower, checking the generator. Routine was supposed to stabilize the mind. At least, that was something Elias used to tell me. The ocean bends time and thought if you're not careful, he once joked. I'd laughed back then. Now the ocean seemed intent on proving him right. By mid-morning, I climbed the tower again. I wanted to reassure myself that everything inside was as it should be, that the light was rotating, that the machinery was functional, that the nightmare from last night belonged firmly behind me. As I ascended, the air grew cooler with each step. Not normal cold, but the kind that sits beneath the skin, a cold that remembers things. Halfway up, I stopped. A faint clicking sound echoed from above, sharp, irregular, like glass tapping against glass. The lens shouldn't make that sound. The motor shouldn't either. I continued upward. When I reached the lantern room, the sight that greeted me froze my breath in my throat. The Fresnel lens, several tons of glass, metal, and machinery, wasn't rotating, but the motor was humming and the gears were turning. Only the lens itself was motionless, caught mid-rotation as though something immense held it in place. Rule 2 whispered through my mind. If it stops on its own, do not touch it. Descend the stairs. Wait exactly 7 minutes. This wasn't on its own. The motor was running. The gears were engaged. Someone or something was interfering. A low vibration traveled through the floor, subtle but persistent, almost like the lens resisting something unseen or being resisted. The lens clicked again, glass flexing against tension. I felt the sound in my bones. 7 minutes. I needed 7 minutes. I backed away, careful not to look directly into the frozen lens. A faint, shimmering distortion hovered near its center, like heat rising off pavement, but colder, violating the natural movement of air. My pulse hammered. I turned and made for the stairs. Halfway down, the humming deepened like something massive was shifting within the tower walls. The stair rail trembled. The air tasted metallic, electric, alive. I reached my quarters and glanced at my watch. 7:41 a.m. 7 minutes from now would be 7:48. I sat on the edge of the bed, breath shallow, listening. The humming grew louder, then softened, then surged again in a rhythm that felt almost biological. The tower wasn't simply vibrating, it was breathing, inhalation, exhalation, a long, slow cadence. When the 7 minutes were finally up, the humming stopped abruptly, and the sudden silence made my skull ring. I climbed the stairs again, slower this time. At the top, the lens stood still, but the shimmering distortion was gone. This was good. Probably. Maybe. Then something happened that shattered any illusion of safety. As I approached the machinery, the lens twitched, just a fraction, but enough to make the entire structure groan. A hairline crack had appeared on the outer ring of glass, so thin it was almost invisible, but it hadn't been there before. Fresnel lenses do not crack easily. Their construction is too thick, too reinforced, especially along the outer rings. The crack traced inward, spiraling subtly toward the center like a snail shell. It looked almost intentional. I swallowed against a rising tide of panic. I had two options: activate the emergency manual rotation, or walk away and pretend nothing happened. But something in me, curiosity, stubbornness, maybe the ghost of my brother, pushed me toward the control panel. I needed to know whether the machinery was actually functional or whether something external had forced the lens still. I reached out and flipped the secondary switch. The motor groaned, the gears shuddered, and the lens did not move. Then, a sound that did not belong anywhere in nature rippled through the lantern room. Not a scream, not a hiss, not a roar, something like the resonance of deep water beneath unimaginable pressure, and buried inside that resonance, a voice, my name, whispered. But from where? I stumbled back so fast my heel caught the top step. My body lurched, and I barely grabbed the rail before falling. The voice lengthened into something like a syllable, then dissolved into static and low-frequency vibration. The tower shivered with it. I bolted down the stairs, taking them too fast, nearly slipping twice. When I reached my quarters, I slammed the door behind me, though it offered no real protection. My breath came in ragged bursts. I checked the time again. 8:02 a.m., too early for stress-induced hallucinations. Too early for the mind to warp itself around fear. I grabbed the notebook, flipping through pages, looking for anything, any hint that the lens might fail or stop while the machinery still operated. Nothing. Not even a scratched-out note. But given the torn-out page, maybe that was intentional. Maybe the previous keeper had wanted to write something but couldn't, or wasn't allowed. I realized then that despite the crack in the frozen lens, daylight didn't feel any safer. In fact, the tower seemed more alert now, more interested. If something had tried to interfere with the light last night, it wasn't stopping, it was testing, and it had escalated. I forced myself to go outside. The air was crisp, sharp, biting through my jacket. The ocean sprawled out in every direction, indifferent and ancient. The horizon looked impossibly straight, until it wasn't. A faint ripple, too large to be a wave, too smooth to be wind, moved along the distant line where sea met sky. It pulsed outward like a heartbeat, and for a fraction of a second, the horizon dipped, as if something enormous beneath the water rolled onto its side. I blinked hard, convinced I'd misseen it. The world snapped back into its rightful shape, flat and balanced, but I knew what I'd seen, or what I thought I'd seen. The ocean was doing something it shouldn't. A gull drifted overhead, screeching. Its cry dissolved into the wind, but beneath it, far beneath it, something echoed. A hollow, resonant sound, like a call from the deep, almost a response. I backed away toward the entrance. Inside, the radio crackled. I froze. Another crackle, then a faint, staticky voice cut through as Joe Nas. Not my brother's voice this time. It was mine, not the tone I was thinking in, not an echo. My voice spoken aloud, repeating my name. Jonas, Jonas, Jonas. Rule 6. If you hear someone speak your name inside the tower, do not reply. Your voice is the only one allowed in here. But this wasn't the tower. This was the radio. The rules didn't say anything about that. Jonas? My voice deepened into static, then rose again, distorted, as though stretched over something that wasn't quite human vocal cords. A low thump echoed up the tower, then another, slow, rhythmic, like footsteps, ascending. My skin crawled. I lunged for the radio and switched it off. Silence flooded the room instantly, unnervingly absolute. The footsteps stopped, everything stopped, and then the generator flickered. Once, twice. The lights dimmed, then surged. A low groan moved through the walls like a warning or an invitation. I didn't know which was worse. I sat back slowly, feeling the lighthouse watching me, not with malice, but with a patient curiosity, as if it already knew something I didn't, and as if, soon enough, I'd understand exactly why the rules existed, and why breaking them, even accidentally, was not a mistake I could afford to repeat. I didn't notice the breach the moment it happened. It wasn't like the movies where alarms shriek and lights flash and everyone instantly realizes something has gone wrong. No, out here, the world doesn't announce its ruptures. It lets you discover them slowly, the way you might realize a tooth is cracking only when your tongue brushes a sharp edge. The storm had passed sometime around dawn, though dawn is a generous word for the thin gray smear that spread across the sky. I had slept maybe 2 hours, my dreams filled with the sound of deep knocking, slow, deliberate, impossibly large knuckles tapping on the concrete shell of the lighthouse. When I woke, sweaty and unsettled, I told myself it had only been thunder, but I avoided looking at the horizon through the window as I dressed. I didn't want to risk seeing anything greet me back. By mid-morning, the wind had died to a soft, irregular pulse. I brewed coffee, its warmth grounding me more than the caffeine. The kitchen window looked out toward the North Cliffs, where waves curled like white claws. That was when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a dark patch in the surf, maybe seaweed, maybe the shadow of a cloud. But clouds were sparse, and the mast didn't move with the water. It sat there, stubbornly still, like something submerged but not quite hidden. I leaned closer. The shape wasn't natural, it was too symmetrical, too clean. A circle, perfect and black. About 20 feet across, hovering just below the surface as if the ocean were a sheet of glass and the thing pressed against it from beneath. As I watched, the water around it began to behave strangely, moving inward rather than outward, pulled toward the circle like a draining sink. A low vibration traveled across the waves, disturbing the surface tension in delicate concentric ripples. I stepped back from the window, nearly knocking over my coffee. It wasn't just something in the water, it was something pushing through. Rule 3 struck me like a slap. Do not acknowledge the horizon between 1 and 4 in the morning. I hadn't looked at it last night, at least not knowingly. But the rules implied that the horizon was dangerous, that something watched or waited or pressed against it at certain hours. If something had crossed through, had it been because of the storm? Or had it been because something else out there had decided the storm was an opportunity? I grabbed the logbook. My hands were shaking enough that my handwriting looked erratic, like the script of a frightened child. I wrote down everything I had seen. The circle, the pull of the water, the vibration. I debated calling the Coast Guard again. But what would I say? There's a perfect black circle under my lighthouse. The ocean is misbehaving. They'd dismiss me as stressed, sleep-deprived, or maybe drunk. And a part of me, an uncomfortably growing part, feared what might happen if too many people looked in this direction. Whatever this was, it didn't want witnesses. I knew that instinctively, the way you know not to stick your hand into a dark, unknown hole. Some things hide because they're weak. Others hide because they are so powerful they have no need to announce themselves. This felt like the latter. I tried to get back to my maintenance tasks, but paranoia filled the air around me like humidity. Every creak of the lighthouse felt deliberate. Every distant splash seemed too heavy, too intentional. Around noon, I forced myself outside to check the generator on the west side of the building. The air carried the metallic scent that often follows storms, But there was something else, something faint and coppery, as if blood had been diluted into the mist. When I reached the cliff's edge, I looked down despite everything telling me not to. The circle was still there, but it had changed. It was larger, maybe 25 feet now. The water around it rotated slowly, like a lazy whirlpool. The edges of the circle weren't crisp anymore. They wavered, blurring into the surrounding sea, and there were shapes moving just beneath it. Not flowing like fish, more like drifting, or rising. One of them pressed close enough to the underside of the circle's surface that I saw its outline, a broad, smooth curve, then a sliver of motion like the blink of a vertical eye. I clamped a hand over my mouth. The ocean didn't feel vast at that moment. It felt crowded, as if something huge pressed its weight against a flimsy door. I forced myself to turn away, walking quickly toward the lighthouse with a childish desire not to be chased. My skin crawled so intensely I felt heat radiating from it. Inside, I locked the door behind me, though the lock was symbolic at best. By late afternoon, the air inside the tower had become stuffy, claustrophobic. The quiet was broken only by the soft ticking of the beacon's motors and my own anxious heartbeat. I tried to read, tried to distract myself, but my mind kept drifting back to the circle. The way the water had pulled inward, the way something inside it had blinked. Around 5, while I was halfway down the spiral stairs, the lighthouse shuddered so hard I grabbed the railing to avoid falling. Not wind, not the foundation settling. A thud, deep, resonant, impossibly heavy, echoed through the cylindrical chamber like a punch from the earth's fist. The thud came again, louder this time. Dust drifted from the ceiling. For a moment, I imagined something enormous standing on the rocks outside, testing the structure, knocking to see if it was hollow or occupied. I stayed frozen on the stairs, not breathing. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. Silence returned, but it was no relief. It felt like the pause in a conversation where someone decides whether or not to tell you the truth. When night fell, I forced myself to follow the rules. Every single one. I rotated the lens on schedule. I kept the east door locked. I avoided the 3rd floor completely. And I did not, under any circumstances, look toward the horizon between 1 and 4 in the morning. But I heard things moving through the water in long, sweeping strokes that couldn't belong to any living creature I knew. Things brushing against the stone supports beneath the tower. Things knocking again, softly now, as if testing each segment of the lighthouse like a creature sniffing its prey through a cage. At 3:17 in the morning, I heard something worse. A voice. Not outside. Inside the walls. A whisper that wasn't quite human, rising and falling in cadences without meaning. It sounded like language the way smoke resembles a solid shape, suggestive but never whole. I covered my ears and waited for dawn. When the gray light finally came, I realized something with absolute clarity. The breach wasn't in the sea. It was in the rules, and something was trying to step through the opening I had made by not understanding them. Something patient, something ancient, something that had noticed me. Sleep didn't come after that night. Not truly. I drifted in shallow, twitching dozes, always waking with the sensation that someone had leaned close to my ear and spoken a word I couldn't remember. When the morning finally arrived, its gray light felt thinner than before, stretched across the sky like a fraying sheet. The circle in the water, if it was still there, I refused to look. Every instinct told me that observing it gave it power, or direction, or invitation. Like acknowledging an intruder in your house who hasn't realized you're awake yet. Instead, I busied myself with chores, filling the hours with structure. I checked the oil levels, wrote the daily weather entry in the logbook, cleaned the lantern room windows, tightened bolts along the west railing. It was all pointless busy work. The tower functioned fine, but it kept my thoughts from spilling into darker places. Around mid-morning, the radio crackled. My pulse jumped. The unit had been silent since before the storm. The Coast Guard only checked in every few days, and not usually this early. I picked it up with a relief that bordered on desperate. "Station 9 reporting," I said. "Go ahead." Static hissed. Then a voice pushed through, thin, metallic, wavering between frequencies in a way no normal transmission should. Ost, guard, copy? The voice sounded human, technically, but there was something off about the cadence, like the words were being repeated by someone who didn't fully understand them. "This is Station 9 Lighthouse," I said, gripping the radio tighter. "I read you. Please repeat." Another long burst of static answered. Beneath it, something else crept through, something low-pitched, almost infrasonic, a resonance I felt in my ribs more than heard. "Identify yourself," the voice said. Its tone had changed, flattened, as if spoken through clenched teeth or through a smile made of the wrong muscles. "This is Rowan Hale," I said. "Lighthouse keeper. Is this Coast Guard Sector Juno?" Silence. Then, faintly, "Noted." The radio went dead. A dull pressure built behind my eyes. The lighthouse suddenly felt too small, too enclosed. I set the radio down carefully, though every instinct screamed at me to throw it out the nearest window. They had said noted, not copy, not received, not any word the Coast Guard would normally use. Noted like an observation, a cataloging. I went to the logbook and wrote the exchange down, though my handwriting slanted wildly. I forced my breathing to slow. It could have been interference, atmospheric distortion, but I knew better. The same way you know when someone stands behind you in a dark room even before you turn around. Whatever was in the water had found a way to speak, or to mimic speech. And it had asked for my name. By noon, the wind returned, but it blew from the wrong direction. The island normally caught southern winds that carried the brine and kelp smell of open sea. But the breeze that drifted across the cliffs came from the north, from the deeper parts of the ocean, cold and sharp, and carrying a scent like ancient stone pulled from a trench. I felt it on my skin like a warning hand. I tightened my jacket and approached the north-facing window again, unable to stop myself. I looked down. The circle was larger, much larger, maybe 50 feet across now. The water didn't rotate around it anymore. Instead, it sloped inward as though the sea were draining into a funnel with no bottom. The edges of the circle shimmered, not with light, but with distortion, like heat rising from a black desert. And beneath that wavering surface, the shapes moved with clearer intention. There were more of them, and they were closer to the surface than before. One rose high enough that I saw detail, smooth, slate-gray skin stretched over an impossible curvature. No fin, no scales, no barnacles, just sheer alien texture, like the hide of something that had never needed to evolve for predators. The distortion pulsed, and a sound followed, vibrating the window pane, a slow, cavernous hum that felt like a choir made of earthquakes. I staggered back from the glass. The hum deepened. It didn't stop even when I covered my ears. It wasn't sound, not entirely. It was something vibrating through the stone foundation, through the air, through the marrow inside me. I fell to my knees, nauseated, and in the middle of it, I heard whispers woven into the frequency. Soft, coaxing, rhythmic. "You are small. You are alone. You are ours." I don't know if those words were literal or if my mind twisted the sensation into something comprehensible, but I knew the message. The breach was widening, and whatever pressed against it had learned the taste of my attention. I crawled away from the window, shaking, my breath hitched in shallow bursts. I held the railing to steady myself. Then, just as suddenly, the vibration stopped. Not faded, stopped. The silence afterward felt cavernous, like the world had briefly forgotten to exist. When I could stand again, I forced myself up the spiral stairs to the lantern room. The beacon still rotated, steady and reassuring in its mechanical monotony. I stared at it with something like gratitude. The rules might be absurd, terrifying, arbitrary, but they existed for a reason I no longer doubted. The island's radio antenna jutted from the lighthouse roof, slightly bent by the storm. I inspected it, if only to calm my nerves. Then I froze. A strip of seaweed hung from the metal frame. But it wasn't any seaweed I recognized. Its strands were too long, too dark, almost translucent. Worse, its texture pulsed, not like something alive, more like something remembering life. My stomach twisted. How could something from the water reach the top of the lighthouse? The The tower was nearly 30 meters tall. The cliff added another 20. Nothing should be able to throw debris that high, not even the night's storm. I used a metal rod to pry the thing from the antenna. It clung stubbornly as if reluctant to detach. When it finally dropped, it landed with a wet slap and curled faintly on the floor like a dying animal. I shoved it off the roof with the rod, repulsed. As I headed back inside, I noticed something else, a faint ringing tone echoing through the stairwell. Not an alarm, not machinery, not wind. A tone that pulsed at regular intervals like a sonar beacon. 3 beats. Pause. 3 beats. Pause. It took me far too long to recognize the pattern. It was the same interval the beacon used when sending identification signals to passing ships, except the lighthouse wasn't sending anything. It was receiving. I gripped the railing hard enough to hurt. Someone, or something, was signaling me back. Using my own equipment, using my own pattern, like an echo from the deep answered by something that wasn't supposed to know I existed. As the tone reverberated through the tower's hollow core, the walls seemed to flex. Just slightly, just enough to make me question my senses. Then a whisper drifted down the stairwell, soft as breath. Return the call. I backed away slowly. My hands trembled. I didn't return the call. I didn't touch the radio. I didn't do anything except sit on the floor until my heartbeat slowed enough to feel human again. The rules hadn't warned me about this. They hadn't prepared me for whatever had learned to speak. But as night approached, heavy, expectant, I knew one thing with absolute clarity. Something in the water recognized me now. Something was listening, and it wanted a conversation. I didn't sleep. I don't think anyone could have, not after hearing their own lighthouse speak to them in a voice that didn't belong to machinery or wind or any human throat. The tone continued into the night, faint but steady. 3 pulses. Pause. 3 pulses. Pause. It threaded through the tower like a heartbeat, steady, patient, aware. I avoided the radio. I avoided the windows. I avoided even looking at the horizon line once midnight approached, terrified that by acknowledging the breach again I might encourage whatever pressed against it. But avoidance only lasted so long, and fear has its own gravity. It must have been around 10 when I heard the knocking. Not the oceanic reverberation from the night before, not that deep thrum that rattled the foundation. This was different, sharper, closer. Someone was knocking on the east door. 3 raps, a pause, then 3 more. The exact pattern of the tone echoing through the lighthouse. I froze at the bottom of the stairs, breath caught painfully in my chest. My mind raced through impossibilities. There shouldn't be anyone on the island. The supply boat wasn't due for another week. No tourists, no hikers, no fishermen ever came this far north. And even if someone had washed ashore, they wouldn't be standing upright, knocking politely. The rules pulsed in my memory, especially Rule 4, do not open the east door after sunset. Whoever wrote those rules had known this moment might come, had expected it, which meant that whatever waited outside wasn't a person, or at least not anymore. The knocking came again, louder this time, as if annoyed by my hesitation. I moved quietly to the door, though I knew I shouldn't get close. The old wood swelled in the salt air, its frame thick with years of storms, but now it seemed to thrum faintly under the repeated impacts. I didn't speak, and I sure as hell didn't touch the handle. Then a voice drifted through the cracks, a voice I recognized. Rowan? My stomach turned to ice. It was my brother's voice, Elias, soft, steady, older by 3 years. I hadn't heard it in almost a decade, not since the avalanche that swept him into a ravine in Montana. His death was the hinge my entire life turned on. The reason I drifted, isolated myself, ended up here on a remote posting, keeping watch over an indifferent sea. I pressed my back to the wall, horrified. Rowan, the voice said again, clearer now. Let me in. No. No. Nothing should have access to that voice. Nothing should have the right to it. Please, it said. I'm cold. Memory hit me hard. The way Elias used to say that after long scouting trips, shivering as he warmed by the wood stove, the cadence was perfect, too perfect. Open the door. I bit down on my fist to keep from responding. The lighthouse felt suddenly too narrow, too suffocating, as though the voice seeped through the walls, through the floorboards, through the gaps in reality the breach had widened. Slowly, impossibly slowly, I forced myself toward the nearest window, far from the east entrance. My hands shook so violently I had to brace myself against the counter. I looked out. I wish I hadn't. A man stood on the rocks outside, tall, broad-shouldered, his posture unmistakable. Elias. He wore the same blue jacket he'd disappeared in, sun-faded, frayed cuffs, a missing button. His hair was longer, tangled by wind and sea spray, but the angle of his jaw, the slope of his shoulders, every detail was painfully, devastatingly familiar. But his face, God, his face wasn't right. His skin was too pale, almost gray, and it clung tightly to the bone as though hours had passed since life left it. His eyes, Elias's warm, steady hazel eyes, were wide and glossy, reflecting no light. He turned his head slowly, unnaturally slowly, until his gaze met mine through the window. A thin smile stretched across his lips. It didn't reach his eyes. It didn't look human. "Rowan," he said again, except his lips didn't move this time. The voice came from the walls, from the lighthouse, from the breach. I stumbled back so fast I hit a shelf, sending tools clattering to the floor. The man outside tilted his head, the smile still locked in place. Then he took a step toward the lighthouse, then another, and another. The rocks under his feet were slick with algae, uneven and steep, but he walked as though gravity was optional. His movements were too smooth, too precise, like a puppet guided by invisible strings. He stopped directly beneath the window, stared up at me, and whispered, soft as dead leaves, "Open the door, he wants to see you." My entire body locked. I knew. I didn't know how I knew, but certainty hit like a plunge into icy water. Whatever stood there wasn't Elias. Not a ghost, not a hallucination, not grief resurfacing after years of suppression. It was something wearing him, something that had learned not just my voice, but my memories, my weak points, my grief. Something that had plucked the memory of my brother like a tool from a shelf and shaped itself around it. I backed away from the window, unable to tear my gaze away, even as nausea rose in my throat. Outside, the imitation of my brother lifted one hand, jerky, disjointed, and pressed it flat to the lighthouse wall. The stone bulged inward, just slightly, just enough to make me stagger again. The wall, solid and ancient, bowed like a sheet of rubber beneath his palm. Then he leaned forward and whispered something unbelievably quiet, so quiet I didn't hear it with my ears but felt it vibrate inside my skull. "Let me in." I ran. I didn't think, didn't breathe. I just fled down the stairs to the storeroom, slamming the heavy door behind me. The space was cramped, lined with shelves filled with paint cans, spare bulbs, ropes, and old equipment. I pressed myself against the back wall and clamped my hands over my ears. The lighthouse creaked around me, slowly, steadily, as though weight shifted against its outer shell. Testing. Learning. After maybe 10 minutes, or an hour, or a lifetime, the pressure faded. The voice went quiet. The knocking stopped. When I finally crawled back upstairs, every window was dark. The rocks outside were empty. The sea below was still. But I knew it wasn't over. The breach hadn't just widened. It had chosen a shape, and a voice, and a way to enter if I ever slipped, if I ever broke a rule. "He wants to see you." The words echoed long into the night, all the way until dawn. By the next morning, something had changed in the air. It wasn't just tension, not the usual prickling dread that had become a constant companion since the storm. This was different, denser, as if the island itself had thickened overnight, the atmosphere grown heavy with invisible weight. The lighthouse groaned at intervals, small tremors rolling along its spine. I checked the foundation twice, but the stone was intact. Whatever strained it came from deeper, lower, older than mere erosion or shifting earth. I kept away from the windows. I kept away from the east door. I followed the rules even more religiously, as though each instruction were a brick mortared between me and the thing that wore my brother's face. But the island didn't care about rules, and the breach didn't care about my fear. As the day dragged on, subtle distortions began creeping into the edges of my vision. little flickers as if the air rippled like water heated from beneath. At first I blamed exhaustion, but then objects themselves began to wander. A wrench I distinctly remembered leaving on the workbench would be sitting near the stairs an hour later. A lantern would tilt on its hook, moving an inch or two between my glances. My boots, lined neatly by the door, shifted positions. Subtle, but wrong. At one point, I caught my reflection in the kitchen window, not distorted, but delayed. The reflection blinked a fraction of a second after I did. I stepped back so fast, I nearly fell. The lighthouse wasn't just being watched, it was being studied, as if something were learning how reality worked from the inside out, testing its flexibility, its limits, the rules that held it together. Studying how I moved, too. The thought wormed into my skull and lodged there, throbbing like a rotten seed. I tried to shake it off, but the sensation lingered. Around 4 p.m, fog rolled in without warning. Thick, wet, suffocating fog that swallowed the island in minutes, smothering every sound except the distant churn of the water. Fog wasn't unusual out here, but this fog moved against the wind. By the time dusk approached, I felt cornered inside my own skin. The air hummed with low, intermittent vibrations, like the dying echo of a bell struck underwater. When the beacon switched on automatically, sweeping its white arc across the mist, I climbed to the lantern room to start the evening rotation log. I thought I was alone. I wasn't. At the top of the stairs, my breath caught. The lantern room, usually bright with refracted light and warm reflections, felt strangely darker than it should have. Shadows clung to the corners despite the beacon's blaze, as though the room had been stretched, warped, expanded in some direction the eye couldn't perceive. And something stood beside the lens assembly. A figure, tall, motionless. Facing the glass walls, its silhouette outlined in the rotating beam. For a second, just one, I thought it was Elias again. That raw, violent grief surged up my throat so fast I nearly called his name. But this figure was wrong in a new way. Too tall, limbs too long, head tilted too sharply, like it was studying the horizon with predatory stillness. It didn't turn when I entered. I didn't breathe, didn't move. My hand slipped to the heavy metal flashlight at my belt, not in any real hope of defense, but because instinct demanded something solid to cling to. The figure raised one hand, long fingers splayed, and pressed it against the glass. The glass bent beneath the touch, bending inward as though softening, melting. And then it spoke. Not from its face. It had no mouth. Not from the air. From the lighthouse walls themselves, resonating through the stone with an unnatural clarity. You broke the order. My spine stiffened. The words weren't an accusation. They were a statement, a simple truth delivered like a weather report, and I knew exactly when I had broken it. The night Elias, the imitation, stood on the rocks. I looked out the window after sunset. I acknowledged what waited outside. My gaze had crossed the forbidden horizon line after dark. A rule broken. A door opened. My voice cracked. I didn't open the door. The figure shifted, just a little, but enough for its shadow to stretch unnaturally long across the curved glass, warping to the movement of the beacon's spinning beam. The door is not wood, the voice said. The door is attention. My heartbeat slammed against my ribs. The rules weren't about physical boundaries. They were about perception, about not seeing something that wanted to be seen, about preventing the breach from widening through awareness. A terrible cold understanding settled over me. I had fed it. Slowly, the figure turned its head toward me. There was no face, just smooth flesh where features should be. But the tilt of the head conveyed a terrible curiosity, a studying. You are small, it said. You are porous. I don't understand, I whispered. You let him in. My stomach dropped so violently my knees nearly buckled. Elias, the voice. The imitation on the rocks. I didn't open the door, I repeated weakly. No, the voice agreed. You opened something else. The air thickened, soupy, suffocating. The beacon's rotation slowed, the gears whining under invisible pressure. The figure stepped toward me, one long, deliberate stride, then another. The room seemed to shrink around its movement. My mouth went dry. As it approached, the lighthouse groaned, deep, heavy, like metal under strain. Then the figure stopped just a few feet from me. I could feel its presence, not heat or cold, but mass, like gravity pulling at the edges of my bones. It leaned toward me without bending. Reality bent instead. Space compressed. "Do you feel it?" it whispered. "Where he waits." A wave of nausea crashed through me. I stumbled backward, gripping the railing, because I did feel something deep beneath the island. Not movement, not vibration, something like attention, cold, patient, older than the ocean itself. The figure's head tilted even farther, an impossible angle that scraped the edges of sanity. He is listening. He is near. My breath shuddered shallowly in my chest. "What does he want?" I whispered. The shadowed figure leaned closer, its non-existent face inches from mine. "He wants to know how you taste." Something inside me snapped, raw, primal terror overriding paralysis. I staggered backward, reaching blindly for the stairs. The figure didn't move to stop me. It just watched, posture unreadably still. As I fumbled down the spiral steps, its voice followed, soft, patient, sliding down the walls like oil. 16 nights, 16 rules. You will break more. My foot slipped on the iron stair. I nearly fell the last flight, and as I hit the bottom, panting, shaking, the voice whispered one final phrase, spoken with something almost like anticipation. "He always gets in by the end." The storm didn't ease until near dawn. By then, the lighthouse's old bones had grown for hours, and the windows had rattled like teeth chattering in a fever dream. I barely slept. Every crack of thunder felt like someone pounding on the door downstairs. I finally drifted off sometime after sunrise. I woke to silence. Not calm, not peace. A held breath kind of silence, like the entire island was listening. I forced myself out of bed and went through the morning checklist. I opened the logbook. I half expected a new line of handwriting to have appeared, like last time, but the page was blessedly blank. For now. The kitchen lights flickered when I turned them on. A pulse. Once. Twice. That was new. I filled the kettle and stared out the window while it heated. The sea was still rough, but no longer violent. Fog curled low against the rocks. Normal by this island's standards. I almost convinced myself that the previous night had just been stress and sleeplessness. Almost. Because when I set the kettle down, I realized something was wrong. Subtly, impossibly wrong. My reflection in the microwave door wasn't moving with me. For a heartbeat, I thought it was just the warped metal. The surface wasn't a true mirror, a trick of the angle maybe. So I lifted my hand. My reflection lifted its hand a second late. A cold, creeping numbness crawled across my shoulders. I took a deliberate step back. The reflection took a step forward. Not exaggerated, not monstrous. It still looked like me, same tangled hair, same exhausted eyes, same rumpled shirt, but it moved. Wrong. Too smooth, too curious, like it was studying me with the same unease I felt toward it. Then the microwave light flickered, and in that flicker, the reflection's eyes went completely black, not shadowed, not distorted, just void, like someone had painted over the eyes with midnight. I staggered back, knocking a mug off the counter. It shattered across the floor. The sound broke the moment. The reflection snapped back into sync with me. Just a dirty metal surface again. I stood there panting, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Just nerves. Just imagination. The island had been wearing me down since day one. Lack of sleep could do strange things. But I couldn't shake the heavy, nauseous certainty that something had looked out at me. Something behind my face. I cleaned the broken mug with shaking hands. Then I went upstairs. The lighthouse stairs groaned beneath me. The beam at the top kept its steady rotation, mercifully normal. I stepped into the lantern room and paused. Something was different here too. Not wrong, not threatening, just placed. In the exact center of the floor, directly beneath the rotating beam, sat a small object, a shard of glass, rough edges, cloudy surface, looked like it had once been part of an old mirror. There was no mirror anywhere in the lighthouse, not a single one. My predecessor's notes had warned me about that. Rule 4. If you see your reflection anywhere inside the lighthouse tower, destroy the surface immediately. It is not you. My breath locked in my throat. I didn't touch the shard. I didn't move closer. I backed away one slow step at a time, refusing to blink. Because, for a moment, just a flicker, I thought I saw a faint shape shifting inside its clouded surface, something like the curve of a cheekbone, a shadow where an eye should be, not fully formed but waiting, almost patient, almost hungry. I forced myself downstairs, my pulse hammered in my ears. The moment my feet hit the bottom step, the lighthouse gave a soft metallic ding, like something tapping lightly on the outside wall. Then again. And again. 3 slow knocks. I approached the front door as quietly as I could. The storm had passed. There was no reason for anything to be hitting the tower. Whatever was knocking was doing it deliberately. The knock stopped when I reached the door. My hand hovered over the knob. Then, faintly, like a whisper from just the other side of the wood, I heard a voice. My voice. Let me in. You left me upstairs. I froze. A cold, suffocating dread wrapped around my chest, squeezing until I could barely breathe, because the voice sounded exactly like me. But the cadence was wrong, like someone had stitched together pieces of my speech and smoothed them over with static. I backed away. The knocking didn't resume. The voice didn't call again. But somewhere above me, in the lantern room, I heard a soft scrape on the floorboards, like something dragging itself across the wood, toward the stairs, toward me. I shut myself in the storage room and braced my back against the door until sunset, when it was safe, or safer, when the beam was awake, when the dark things weren't. But even as the lighthouse turned its great patient eye toward the sea, I couldn't stop thinking about the shard of mirror upstairs and the reflection that had moved just a little too late. The island grew louder after sunset. Not with storms, not with waves, but with breathing. A soft, constant swell of air, sometimes thin, sometimes strained, sometimes so close it felt like someone exhaling against the back of my neck. I didn't light any lamps inside. The lighthouse beam above me rotated in slow, deliberate arcs, filling the tower with rhythmic pulses of white light. Every time the beam swept through the room, the shadows bent away, retreating like spilled ink recoiling from heat. I stayed at the kitchen table, the journal open in front of me. The page where the handwriting had appeared on its own, the one that hadn't been mine, was still blank again. Too blank. The page felt scrubbed, as though the paper fibers had been rearranged. For an hour, nothing changed. Then, as the beam passed through the room for perhaps the 100th time, a shiver crawled over the page. Not wind, not moisture, movement. The letters seeped up from the paper like bruises rising beneath skin. Do not trust your eyes tonight. A knot tightened in my stomach. More writing formed, each stroke appearing like a thin slit opening in pale flesh. If you see yourself, leave the room immediately. If it follows, run. If it speaks, do not answer. If it smiles, hide. If it knocks, pray. My hands went numb. This felt different from the first message. Urgent. Rushed. The ink almost jittered across the page, as though written by someone whose hand wouldn't stop shaking. A final line appeared. If it asks to come inside, it means it already has. I shut the journal so fast the sound echoed through the kitchen. The beam passed overhead again. This time, the light wavered. A tiny flicker, barely a breath, but enough to make the shadows thicken around the edges of the room. And in that flicker, I saw, through the glass of the oven door, my reflection. Except, I had my hands on the table, and the reflection had one hand raised as though waving. I jerked back, chair scraping across the floor, sending a shock of cold panic through me. The reflection lowered its hand, tilted its head, studied me with a stillness that felt predatory. I looked away. Rule 4 pounded in my skull. Destroy any reflective surface. It is not you. Without thinking, I grabbed the flashlight from the counter and swung it hard. Glass shattered. The reflection snapped into scattered fragments across the floor. But one shard didn't fall. One shard stayed, hovering upright in the oven frame, balanced at an impossible angle. And in that shard, my reflection didn't break. It leaned closer. Too close. Its breath fogged the inside of the glass, not the outside. The inside. Something cold touched my ankle. I didn't look down. I ran. I bolted up the stairs toward the lantern room, the safest place after dark. The beam was stronger there. The light kept the wrong things away. Halfway up, the tower groaned. Something knocked. 3 sharp taps against the outside wall. Then, a fourth, inside. I reached the landing, slammed the lantern room door shut, and locked it. My lungs burned. My hands shook. The entire tower trembled like something enormous was brushing against it from the sea. The rotating beam filled the room with harsh white flashes. Only then did I notice the mirror shard. Still in the exact spot I'd seen it earlier, only now it was larger. Twice as large. A fresh edge gleamed, newly broken, as if it had grown, and in its fogged surface, something stood behind me. A silhouette, my silhouette. But the shoulders were wrong, too sharp, too high, like something had forced its way into my shape without understanding how a human body fit together. It raised an arm in the shard's surface. Slowly, so slowly, I didn't move. I didn't blink. And then the shard whispered, not in my voice, in my predecessor's. You shouldn't have answered the first knock. Say continue when you're ready for Chapter 10. Chapter 10, The Thing That Knocks. 1,100 words, Dung Phong Kach Famat Trien. The shard whispered again. You shouldn't have answered the first knock. My blood iced over. I turned away from the reflection, refusing to meet its warped imitation of me. The lantern room was supposed to be safe, elevated, bright, open to the sea on all sides. But now the light felt thin, stretched, barely holding back a dark that pressed against the glass like a rising tide. The silhouette in the shard tilted its head. The motion was too smooth, boneless. My breath trembled in my throat. Leave me alone, I muttered, backing away. You're not real. The reflection smiled, not with my mouth, with something that had far too many teeth. The shard hummed, a low, vibrating note that resonated through the metal railing of the lantern room. My skin crawled. I grabbed the nearest object, a metal maintenance wrench, and hurled it at the shard. It hit the floor with a clatter, but the shard remained suspended, floating an inch above the iron grate, spinning slowly, reflecting angles of the room that didn't exist. Places in the lighthouse that had no geometry, no doors, no purpose. Places that belonged to some other architecture. Another knock echoed through the tower, this time from below. Then another, 2 floors down. Then another from somewhere just beneath the lantern room, like something was moving through the lighthouse, searching each level. Ascending. The journal's warning slammed through my mind. If it knocks, pray. I had never prayed in my adult life. But now the words curled instinctively against my tongue, heavy and useless. The shard rotated until its reflective surface pointed directly at the spiral stairs behind me. The shapes in the glass darkened. Movement. A figure climbed the stairs, slowly, deliberately, unhurried, like it already knew I had nowhere else to go. The tower vibrated with each step it took, as though the metal were bending under a weight it was never designed to bear. I backed toward the lighthouse lens, its warm mechanical hum the only living sound. My hand reached instinctively for the manual rotation lever. I didn't know why, but something deep in my body, older than language, told me the light mattered. The figure reached the top of the stairs but didn't emerge yet. It paused at the landing, just out of sight. Only its shadow stretched across the floor, bloated and distorted. Stay back, I said, voice cracking. Something scraped across the landing. A dragging sound. Wet. The shard behind me vibrated harder, like it were straining to continue mirroring whatever approached. Then something stepped into view. It wore my shape, but only in the way someone might wear a damp costume stolen from a corpse. The limbs were wrong lengths. The eyes were pits of watery reflection. The joints bent the wrong way, like it was trying to remember how bones worked. When it inhaled, its chest expanded too far, stretching, creaking like a sail catching wind. It opened its mouth, not to speak, but to knock. 3 soft taps against its own ribs, like knuckles striking wood. The sound echoed through the lantern room. I stumbled back, hitting the edge of the massive Fresnel lens. The tower shook again. This time not from the creature, but from the waves pounding the cliffs with sudden violence. The lighthouse dimmed, just a flicker. But in that moment, the thing surged forward, fast, fluid, boneless. Its arms unfurled like lengths of wet rope. I grabbed the manual rotation lever and yanked it. The lighthouse beam lurched. Faster now, sweeping the room in rapid arcs. The sudden burst of brilliance hit the creature full on. It recoiled violently, skin blistering like overheated film. Its body folded backward at the waist, vertebrae snapping like piano wires. It shrieked, a hollow, echoing cry like someone screaming into a canyon underwater. As the beam passed again, it collapsed, melting into a puddle of reflective sludge that writhed across the grating, trying to find a shadow deep enough to hide in. The entire room tilted. No, I tilted. My vision blurred. My ears filled with pressure. It felt as if the sky above the lighthouse had inverted and was now hanging beneath my feet. A whisper crawled through the air. Not from the shard. Not from the creature. From everywhere. The light is not yours. The beam flickered violently, sputtering, dimming. Panic gripped me. I forced the manual lever to keep the rotation going, straining my muscles. The tower groaned, metal screaming against metal. Below, something pounded up the stairs again. Not one thing. Several. The sludge reconstituted itself in the corner of the room, rising shape first, pulling bones and sinew out of thin air with sickening pops. Its head snapped back into place, eyes reforming as swirling pools of glassy liquid. It wasn't injured. It had simply learned. This time it came toward me slowly, almost tenderly, its face smoothing into a perfect copy of mine. But where its lips parted, a second mouth split open at the jawline, whispering in a voice too close to thought, "Let me in." The journal's warning hammered through me. If it asks to come inside, it means it already has. The creature extended a hand, my hand. But inside its palm was a pupil, blinking, wet, staring directly into me. The sight sent a convulsion of nausea through my body. My knees buckled, its false mouth smiled. The shard floated beside it, vibrating like a tuning fork struck by a god. I glanced at the shard, and for an instant I saw something looking through it. Not at me, through me. A vast, submerged eye, miles wide, blinking. The lighthouse lens began to crack. Hairline fractures spread across its glass like spiderwebs under ice. A fracture shot from one end to the other with an audible snap. No, come on. I strained against the lever, forcing the beam to sweep again. The creature stepped forward. The light hit it. It didn't recoil this time. It merely observed the beam, studied it, tilted its head like a child understanding a toy for the first time, and then its skin shifted, mirroring the light, absorbing its brightness into a silver sheen. The lighthouse dimmed again. The beam sputtered once, twice, then died. Darkness swallowed the room, and in the black, something pressed its forehead to mine. My own voice whispered inches from my ear, "You should never have taken this job." Darkness didn't simply fall, it poured. Thick, heavy. A presence with weight and temperature. It pressed against my skin, soaking into my pores like ink creeping into paper fibers. I gasped, but the air tasted wrong. Thin, metallic, as though filtered through something that lived in the walls. Something still leaned against me, forehead to forehead. Breathing softly, exactly the way I breathed. "Get away from me," I whispered, or tried to whisper. My voice felt swallowed the moment it left my throat, consumed by the suffocating black. The thing inhaled. A long, deliberate breath, and in that inhale I felt the world tilt, an inversion of gravity that made my vision spin even though I saw nothing. I staggered backward, hands groping the air until my palms hit the cool brass of the lantern room's railing. My heart hammered. My muscles jolted with adrenaline, but my eyes refused to adjust. Not even a silhouette appeared. The darkness was total, complete, unnatural. Somewhere below, footsteps echoed, too many, moving in rhythmic, syncopated patterns as though multiple versions of myself were ascending the tower in perfect, silent coordination. My breath hitched. I forced myself to listen. Not panic, not freeze. Listen. There, beneath the footsteps, a subtle noise, like distant waves moving through a cavern miles below the sea. A slow, rhythmic pulse. The sound filled the tower, vibrating up through the metal grating and straight into my teeth. A heartbeat. But it wasn't human. The darkness answered. It whispered through the walls, cold and intimate. You were not chosen. You opened the door yourself. My spine tightened. Show yourself, I said, though terror dragged at every word. Something laughed, not loudly, soft, like a breath caught on wet stones. A faint glow pulsed at the far end of the lantern room, barely a smudge of light in the perfect void. I tried to focus on it, desperate for something visible. The glow grew. A circle, then an oval, then a vertical slit. An eye, not an object reflecting light, an actual eye, large, lidless, and impossibly distant, as though staring through a window that pierced reality. The glow was not illumination, but awareness, its light the accidental byproduct of something thinking. As it focused on me, my stomach lurched, a primal chemical reaction, a biological acknowledgement that this was a predator my species was never meant to encounter. I stumbled backward until my spine hit the cold metal housing of the Fresnel lens. My hand slid across glass, fractured, trembling. The eye blinked. When it opened again, there were 3 more beside it. Then 6. Then hundreds. A field of them. A night sky made of sight. Each eye watched me with detached curiosity. Not hunger, not cruelty, just attention. As though studying a curious ripple in a tide pool. A voice rose beneath the pulse. A layered symphony of whispers in dozens of tones, all speaking at once. You call this place isolated. You think yourself alone, yet you stand at the shore of a sea that touches all things. The darkness behind the eyes rippled. A shape moved beneath it, something vast, buoyant, slow. Its motion stirred the air in the lantern room, sending a cold gust against my face. Why me? I choked out. What do you want? The voices overlapped again, echoing inside my skull. Not you. Not want. Only openings, only rules, only light. Something slid across the floor toward me, a soft, wet drag. I braced for the creature that had worn my shape. But instead, the journal emerged from the black, the same battered leather, its pages fluttering open on their own, the same page that had warned me, now glowing faintly in the sensory void. Words bled across the paper, new ones. There are more rules. You were not given all of them. My pulse hammered. The eye field pulsed in unison. The journal's page expanded the ink. Rule 6. Never let the light go out. You have broken Rule 6. My chest tightened. My breath shortened. I didn't know, I whispered. The eyes blinked in waves, spreading outward like ripples across the skin of some enormous organism. The whispers answered, knowledge is not the shield you believe it is. Your world thinks light reveals truth. Light only hides darkness from itself. Behind me, the Fresnel lens cracked further. A thin piece of glass fell and shattered at my feet. The sound was swallowed instantly, devoured by the darkness. The journal's words continued forming. Rule 7. If it smiles, hide. You did not hide. My throat constricted, every hair on my arms raised. The soft, scraping footsteps returned, this time directly behind me. I didn't turn. Couldn't. I already knew what I'd see. Something leaned close, its breath brushing the base of my skull. My own voice spoke into my ear, but stretched, watery, like someone playing back my speech on damaged tape. You broke the rules. The eyes in the dark dilated, converging toward me like a tunnel collapsing inward. My equilibrium shattered. I dropped to my knees, palms hitting the cold metal grate. A new line formed on the journal. Rule 8 does not exist. If you search for it, you will find something else. A shiver crawled down my spine. What else? I whispered. The voices answered in a single, unified tone, so vast it made the metal beneath me vibrate. The one who wrote the rules. The floor shook. Something enormous shifted below the tower, lifting, rising, as though the island itself were inhaling. The eyes blinked out all at once. Darkness returned, but not silence. Instead, from deep within the black, something began knocking. Slow, heavy, patient. Knock, knock, knock. The same rhythm as before. But now it came from the water far beneath the lighthouse, and with each knock, the island seemed to drop a fraction of an inch, as if settling into something colossal waiting below. My breath trembled. The journal's ink shifted one final time. Ide is already here, and it knows you. The knocks grew deeper, not louder, deeper. Each strike vibrated through the stone foundation, up the iron veins of the lighthouse, into my bones. Every impact felt like a pulse from something vast and submerged, calling up through the dark water beneath the island. Something had woken. The journal lay on the floor, its pages still spilling soft light. But the illumination did nothing to push back the black. The room remained a void, as if the darkness were no longer a lack of light, but a substance, thick and deliberate. A fifth knock landed, slow, measured, certain. The air shifted, the void inhaled. Then a soft shuffle sounded directly in front of me, inches from my kneeling form. Something approached, slowly, cautiously, like a blind creature learning its surroundings. I squeezed my eyes shut, a whisper brushed against my cheek. Look, I didn't. I refused. A cold hand cupped my jaw, my own hand, my own skin temperature, my own scars. Yet wrong in every subtle way. Fingers too long, palm too smooth, nails too soft as if printed rather than grown. It guided my face upward. Don't, the whisper returned, this time inside my skull. Look, my eyes opened and I saw nothing. Not darkness. Nothingness. A colorless void that pressed against my vision like a fabric stretched too close to my face. Then a ripple moved across it. One single, subtle wave. The void thinned. A shape emerged. At first, I thought it was a man, a silhouette with human proportions standing several feet away. But the longer I looked, the less human it became. Its limbs didn't bend, they folded like lengths of wet paper settling into new shapes. Its head was smooth and featureless except for faint depressions where eyes might have been. The impression of a face, not a face itself. The thing radiated a presence, ancient, patient, entirely emotionless. Understanding struck like a cold needle through my spine. This was not the creature that copied me, not the thing that knocked, not the eyes that filled the dark. This was something older, the author of the rules. It unfurled one arm, bones sliding beneath skin like a wind moving across a field of tall grass. In its hand, it held something small, a pen, my predecessor's pen. It extended it toward me. The whispering chorus rose again, layered distant, like thousands speaking underwater. You seek the final rule. You seek what was never yours. My throat tightened. I don't want it. The void rippled. Wanting does not matter. You opened the light. You broke the sixth rule. You called us here. The pen dropped at my feet. I recoiled, but it rolled against my knee with a soft metallic clink, leaving a thin smear of ink that pulsed faintly like a heartbeat. Below us, another knock rose, not against the lighthouse, not against stone, but somewhere beneath the world itself. A sound so deep it felt like hearing a mountain shift in its sleep. The silhouette stepped closer. Your predecessor failed, as you have failed. The lighthouse is not a beacon. It is a lock. A lock. My breath froze in my lungs. Then, what does it keep out? The void around the silhouette quivered as though thousands of shapes turned their unseen faces toward me. Out! A sound rippled through the darkness, something between a laugh and a tremor. Child of Earth, you misunderstand. The light does not protect your world. It imprisons a doorway to us. Cold spread through my torso, chilling my ribs. The journal at my feet flipped to another page, violently, as if an unseen hand turned it. A new rule wrote itself in jagged, rushed strokes. Rule 8. When the light fails, so will you. The pen trembled at my knee. Ink bled from its tip, trailing down the metal grate in thin, branching rivulets that resembled veins. The silhouette bent toward me. Your light has failed. I stumbled backwards, scrambling to my feet. My fingers slid across shattered glass. The tower swayed, the smell of salt thick as blood in the air. A seventh knock detonated through the lighthouse. So powerful the lantern room shifted several inches to the left with a metallic shriek. The Fresnel lens cracked fully down the center, splitting with a sound like a scream. The silhouette tilted its head. The lock is breaking. The opening widens. The ones below rise. Far below, something breached the water. Not with a splash, but with a sound like the ocean inhaling. A massive displacement. A void opened. The pen at my feet twitched. The journal flipped pages until it reached the first rule. The ink shimmered, the letters rearranging themselves. 1. Never turn off the beam. It feeds on darkness. New ink soaked through. It feeds on you. My chest tightened so violently I thought my ribs might crack. The silhouette shifted, folding, collapsing inward like a sheet of light devoured by its own shadow. It reshaped itself. Taller now, limbs stretching into angles impossible for any earthly geometry. Then, it leaned in until its blank face hovered inches from mine. Something unseen brushed across my thoughts, soft fingers rifling through memories. My childhood. My mother's voice. The first time I saw the sea. The moment I stepped onto this island. All peeled open, examined, discarded, the silhouette whispered, "You are a key. All lighthouse keepers are. We only wait for one to break. You have broken." I staggered back into the shattered lens, slipping on broken glass. The silhouette reached for me, but stopped. Something else stirred below the tower, something far larger, older, more patient than the silhouette. The void pulsed outward. The silhouette bowed its head, retreating. Even it was afraid. The journal snapped shut. The pen stilled, and a new voice filled the darkness. Not a whisper, not a chorus, a single voice. Deep, slow, powerful as a tectonic plate grinding against another. The light has fallen. The door is open. Come down. The tower trembled as if kneeling to something rising from the deep. The darkness pulled back just enough for me to see the stairs descending into the black. Waiting. The next morning, I woke to the sound of something tapping against the window. Not wind, not branches. A deliberate, rhythmic tapping, like knuckles on glass. For a moment, I lay frozen beneath the thin blanket, listening. The cabin was still dim, the first hints of dawn just beginning to seep through the shutters. The tapping continued, impossibly patient. Tap, tap, tap. I forced myself up, muscles stiff, and moved toward the window. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to pretend I hadn't heard anything, to stay in the relative safety of my narrow bed. But curiosity has always been my downfall. My mother's words echoed in my mind. The moment fear dictates your actions, you've already surrendered to the island. I lifted the edge of the curtain. Nothing there. The window looked out toward the western cliffs, where the fog swirled low and restless. But just as I started to lower the curtain again, a shape flickered across my peripheral vision. I snapped my gaze up. There was someone, something, standing at the tree line. Tall, dark, unmoving. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. Right at the border where the lighthouse's faint influence seemed to end. Its silhouette was humanoid, but wrong. As if a child had drawn the outline of a person, approximating limbs and posture but missing something essential about how a body should be shaped. I blinked. The figure was gone. The tapping stopped. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. Downstairs, the lighthouse felt different, as if some tension, previously dormant, had now awakened, stretching beneath the floorboards like an animal disturbed from sleep. The walls seemed to breathe in the fog's presence, inhaling its damp chill, exhaling something colder. I found the journal exactly where I'd left it on the table. When I opened it, a new line greeted me. A line I knew had not been there before. Rule 9. If it taps on the window, do not acknowledge it. A chill rolled through me. I hadn't spoken to it. I hadn't opened the window, but I had looked. Was that what counted as acknowledgement? My pulse quickened as I flipped through the pages. More ink, twisting, erratic, had appeared since the night before. It watches the new keeper. It likes curiosity. It always tests first. The handwriting had deteriorated, devolving into jagged, trembling strokes that suggested panic or pain, or both. I slammed the journal shut. Whatever the figure was, it had been here long before me, long before my predecessor. The journal wasn't just a guide. It was a chronicle of a war he'd been fighting alone, and I had already broken another rule. The rest of the day passed in a haze of tension. Every so often, I caught hints of movement beyond the fog, distant, gliding shapes that vanished when I tried to focus. The sea remained eerily calm, its surface mirror flat, reflecting a sky that didn't seem quite aligned with the one above. Around late afternoon, I headed down the spiral stairs to check the generator, trying to focus on anything but the window incident. The metallic scent of oil and rust greeted me as usual, but there was an added smell now. Something organic, something damp and sour. I swept my flashlight across the floor. At first, I thought the dark streaks were spilled fuel until I knelt down and touched one. It was warm and thick. Blood? No. The color was too dark, almost black. When the beam of my flashlight hit the streak again, I noticed something glistening, tiny iridescent flecks, fish scales embedded in tar. The streak led behind a storage cabinet. Slowly, breath trembling, I pushed the cabinet aside. A pile of soaked rope lay tangled on the floor, but it wasn't just rope. Woven among the coils were strands of something fibrous and sinewy, something that looked disturbingly like muscle tissue. The generator lights flickered. Something echoed above me, heavy footsteps on the main floorboards. My heart plunged. I wasn't supposed to have visitors. The island wasn't supposed to have anything big enough to walk like that. A cold realization hit me. Someone was in the lighthouse. Or something. I killed my flashlight, plunging the room into darkness. The footsteps grew slower, deliberate, as if whatever was upstairs was listening for me. Then, the unmistakable creak of the stairwell door opening. A second sound followed, not footsteps. Breathing. Slow, wet, labored, descending the metal steps, one by one, each footfall heavier than the last. My mind raced. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide except the narrow gap behind the boiler unit. I squeezed into the shadows, pressing myself into the cold metal as the breathing grew closer. A shape entered the generator room. I saw it only as a silhouette, tall, hunched, limbs too long to belong to a person. The ceiling lights flickered weakly, revealing glimpses of glistening skin stretched taut over protruding joints. It sniffed the air, searching for me. Something dripped from its elongated fingers. The same black, shimmering substance I'd found on the floor. The creature leaned toward the boiler. For a moment, I thought it had found me. Its breath rattled his from where I hid. A low, guttural sound rumbled from its chest, a sound of hunger or anticipation. Then, as suddenly as it came, it lifted its head and turned away. The footsteps retreated, up the stairs, across the main floor. Silence. I didn't move for a full 10 minutes. When I finally crawled out, shaking, I realized two things with sickening certainty. One, the island wasn't testing me anymore. It was hunting me. Two, whatever had been watching from the tree line at dawn wasn't the only thing here. When I returned upstairs, the journal lay open, not where I'd left it. A single sentence had been scrawled across the page in jagged ink, letters uneven, as though written by a trembling hand, or claws. Rule 10. If it enters the lighthouse, it is no longer outside. The sentence ended in a smear, as if something had dragged the pen away mid-stroke. I stared at the words until my vision blurred. The lighthouse, my one sanctuary, had been breached, and whatever got in was still here. Night fell too quickly. On the mainland, dusk softened things, cast them in warm, fading gold. But here on the island, night was abrupt, final. A curtain pulled shut by unseen hands. By the time the last light drained from the sky, the fog had grown so thick it pressed against the lighthouse windows like a living thing. Each pane vibrated with the slow, rhythmic pulse of windless pressure, as if something enormous was breathing across the glass. I stood in the main room, journal open on the table, the lantern casting a small amber circle around me. Beyond that halo, shadows bled together in ways that strained natural logic. They swirled and stretched, twisting at the edges of the light. Somewhere deep inside the lighthouse, something shifted. A footstep? A dragged limb? A body brushing the wall? Whatever had entered earlier hadn't left. And now that night had taken the island, the rules were no longer suggestions. They were lifelines. I flipped frantically through the journal until my gaze landed on a page I must have skimmed before. Its placement early enough that my predecessor must have considered it foundational. When darkness falls, keep the lantern lit. Its flame is a border the unseen cannot cross, but the lantern must not die. If it sputters, if it dims, prepare for its attention. The ink was darker here, pressed harder into the paper. He had been afraid, and now I understood why. The lantern flickered. Just once, but that was all it took. Something pressed against the floorboards above me, a sudden weight, a shift that groaned through the wood. I froze, my ears strained, silence stretched thin and taut. Then a single, unmistakable sound, a knock, slow-sured, on the attic door. My blood iced. I had never gone into the attic. I didn't even know what was up there. The journal gave no mention of it, no rule addressing its contents. That alone should have been a red flag. My predecessor had rules for everything: the sea, the fog, the cliffs, the tunnels beneath the storage room, but nothing about the attic. Maybe that was the rule. Unwritten, omitted deliberately. Knock. The lantern dimmed again, guttering low, a thin, wavering flame. No. I grabbed the fuel canister beside the table and poured oil into the lantern's basin, my hands shaking so badly it sloshed over the rim. The flame steadied, brightening. The knocking stopped for a moment. Then a different sound emerged, a soft, dragging scrape, like fingertips tracing the attic floorboards. It moved slowly, purposefully, following me, tracking my footsteps through the ceiling. "Stop," I whispered before I could think. "Just stop." The scraping halted abruptly. Silence. The air tightened, a pressure shift I felt behind my eyes, like something listening. I backed toward the lighthouse tower door. The spiral staircase wound upward in the dark, its iron railings cold against my palm. My only plan, if it even qualified, was height. The top of the tower had more light, more lantern oil, and fewer ways for something to corner me. But halfway up the stairs, the journal slipped from under my arm. It tumbled down each metal step. Clang, clang, clang. The moment it struck the bottom landing, something above me moved. In the attic, right above the central stairwell. A long, heavy exhale seeped between the wooden boards, drifting down the shaft. The air carried a smell, metallic, briny, almost sweet. I bolted. Up the stairs, 2-3 steps at a time, heart hammering, lantern clutched to my chest. Behind me, a sound erupted through the lighthouse. A skittering lunge across the attic floor, like dozens of limbs moving at once. The trapdoor at the top of the tower loomed just ahead. I shoved it open and pulled myself into the lantern room, slamming the iron hatch behind me. The hatch didn't lock, but it was heavy, far heavier than anything below. Maybe enough to slow it. Maybe. The Fresnel lens rotated steadily, its beams slicing across the fog-choked night. The rhythmic sweep of light soothed something primal in me, a heartbeat, steady and deliberate. I collapsed against the cold glass, breathing hard. For several minutes, there was nothing but my pulse and the low mechanical hum of the lamp mechanism. Then, scrape. On the hatch, something had climbed the stairs. Scrape. Metal bent inward. Just a fraction. Just a dent. But enough to show strength. Enough to show patience. The lantern flame faltered again. A small cough of embers. I dropped to my knees, refueling it with trembling hands. The flame steadied. The scraping stopped. But a new sound rose. Not from the hatch, but from outside the lantern room. Through the thick glass, the fog parted slightly. Something moved across the walkway circling the tower. A silhouette, tall, angular, wrong in the same way as the figure at the tree line, but now closer. So close I could see the faint outline of 2 long fingers splayed against the window. Its head tilted, curious, unblinking. It tapped the glass, once, twice, slow, deliberate taps. Rule 9, if it taps on the window, do not acknowledge it. My throat tightened. I stared at the floor. I did not move. Tap, tap, tap. Closer now, more insistent. My eyes watered from the effort of keeping them downcast. The thing outside dragged its fingers along the glass, producing a screeching note that vibrated through my bones. The scraping at the hatch resumed, louder this time, more forceful, something inside and something outside. Both aware of me, both crowding closer, both waiting. The lantern flickered again, harder. The flame shrank. No, please, not now. I fumbled for the fuel canister. Empty. A hollow clang echoed when I tipped it upside down. My stomach dropped. The flame sputtered, shrinking to a trembling speck of orange. Outside the window, the figure stilled. At the hatch beneath me, the scraping stopped. Both creatures froze, waiting, watching. And the lantern dimmed and went out. The handle turned with deliberate, patient precision. A click, A pause, another slow rotation. Whoever, whatever was on the other side wasn't forcing its way in. It was announcing itself, entering the way a polite guest might enter a friend's home. But the voice echoing from the hatch wasn't the danger. The danger was already inside, behind me, wearing my voice, mimicking my breath, learning the cadence of my thoughts. The lighthouse beam cut through the fog again, illuminating the room in a sterile white arc. In the reflection on the window, the thing behind me sharpened into clarity. It had grown clearer, more defined. Its shoulders were almost the correct shape now, its arms almost the right length. Its skin, not skin, something nearer to a membrane stretched over shifting angles. It leaned its head toward mine. No breath, no warmth. Just the pressure of presence pushing against reality's fabric. In the hatch behind me, the polite voice spoke again. "I'm coming in now." And the last inch of the handle clicked free. I spun around, raising the lantern like a shield, even though its flame had long died, even though the glass felt colder now than the air. But the hatch didn't open. Instead, the door pushed inward a fraction and stopped, as if something enormous stood behind it, blocking the rest of the way. Politeness, not honest. Reflection behind me hiccuped, a glitch of movement, a jitter as if the shape lost hatch, mirroring my fear. The other wood creaked, metal groaned, the bolts strained. The voice behind the door was no longer speaking to me. It was speaking to the thing behind me. "You shouldn't have worn him." The reflection-like creature tilted its head back toward me, grinning with something that approximated delight but felt closer to hunger. "Worn," it repeated, savoring the word. "Borrowed." A giggle, mismatched and broken. "Measured." The word measured rang through the room like a tuning fork. Suddenly, the lighthouse's rotating beam shuddered, skipped, stuttered 3 times, then held still, aimed directly at the hatch. The leaning, bulging shadow snapped flat against the metal, not gone, merely contained. The thing at my back whispered, "He's waking up." Then the hatch bulged inward, denting a hand's width. I stumbled away. The creature moved with me, not bound to physics, simply appearing at my shoulder each time I blinked. "I didn't call him here," I whispered, my double smiled wider, distending, splitting. "No," it pleased, "but you lit the light." The hatch tore open, not swung, not shattered, tore. Metal peeled like damp paper, edges curling and shrieking. Fog poured in with a sudden violence, cold enough to burn. The room bent around the shape, forcing its way through the opening. The air twisting. The walls bowing inward as though gravity had found a new center. It stepped inside. Not a creature, not a form. Something between a silhouette and a wound in the world. An outline filled with elsewhere. A vertical smear of night sky, stitched with faint moving stars that did not belong to any heaven humans knew. And when it spoke, its voice came from everywhere. "Return what you copied." The mimic at my back ceased smiling. Its shape stuttered violently, as though hundreds of reflections flickered at once inside a single body. "I was here first," it snarled. No longer my voice, but something sharp enough to cut the air. The towering shape turned. The world dimmed, even the lighthouse beamed. "You do not belong, it said again. The mimic lunged, or tried to. The shape in the doorway didn't move, but something shifted in the space between heartbeats. The mimic convulsed. Every line of its form bent backward, inward, collapsed, as though the creature's existence was being folded, refolded, and crumpled down to something smaller than meaning. It shrieked, a ripping noise like a film reel tearing off its spool. Its collapsing shape screamed through my voice, through my predecessor's voice, through voices I didn't know. Then it folded again and vanished. Not died, not destroyed. Removed from the concept of here. The towering shape turned toward me. I could neither move nor breathe. It approached slowly, each step bending the lantern room floor downward, metal rippling under weight that no world was meant to support. The closer it came, the more the walls shuddered. My heartbeat misfired, stumbling. It leaned close. Stars pulsed inside its outline. Ocean tides, black horizons, distances human minds weren't shaped to parse. A single whisper, "Keep the light lit." And then, it stepped backward into the fog. The torn hatch sealed shut behind it with a sound like stone grinding against stone. The metal reformed, smooth, untouched. The lighthouse beam resumed its rotation. The night grew still. I sank to the floor, shaking. Hours passed, or minutes, or a lifetime. When dawn finally bled across the water, gentle and soft, it felt unreal. I found the journal lying beside the lantern. Its pages were no longer blank. A new line had appeared in the same jagged, frantic hand as before. There is no rule that keeps you safe forever, only rules that keep you safe tonight. Another line beneath it, "If you stay, you will learn the rest." And one final sentence, different ink, different hand. I lasted 36 nights. I looked out at the horizon. The sun rose like something fragile, too gentle for what the world truly held. This was my 7th night. The lighthouse hummed softly beside me, a machine older than its paint, older than its purpose. I knew deep down I would not last 36. But as the morning light swept the island, I did the only thing that kept me alive so far. I reached for the lantern, and I lit the flame. End.